Now, for the first time in history, the COVID-19 pandemic has restricted about 90% of the world's citizens from traveling around the globe. Without a doubt, the most affected in travel and tourism is the aviation industry, with an estimated 25 million jobs and 100 million travel and tourism jobs across the globe at risk. The International Air Transport Association estimates that the industry will see its revenue shrink by 44% in 2020, while global GDP will only contract by approximately 3%. Joining me now to paint a better picture of how much harm COVID-19 has caused the aviation sector, particularly in Africa, is the regional head IATA for West Africa, Adefunke Adeyemi. Good morning and thank you for joining us on Business Morning. Of course, the aviation sector is a major casualty of the COVID-19 pandemic and associated problems. Africa has been at the center of these losses, including airline bankruptcies and layoffs. Look at Ethiopian Airlines, for instance. That's the only profitable airline in Africa, and it has reported losses of up to $550 million in the first quarter. Now, do you think that there is a future for this critical industry after this dust settles?
Thank you very much for the question. Good morning, and good morning to our viewers. It's a pleasure to be here with you all. The aviation industry definitely has been one of the hardest hit by the COVID-19 pandemic, as you mentioned in your opening remarks. And 94% of passenger traffic was down in Africa in the first quarter of this year. This is a significant amount, meaning that no one was flying. The only flights that were happening were for essential services and for medicines to get across the continent. Globally, we estimate that the industry will take a hit of about $400 billion this year, $400 billion US dollars. For African aviation, we're estimating $6 billion loss in revenue to the airlines, as well as a negative impact of $28.5 billion to African economy's GDP, as well as putting 3 million jobs at risk. So this is a really critical situation and what people could call a perfect storm. However, aviation is a critical enabler for economies. Modern society really had not been able to function as effectively as it could have until aviation developed. And we've seen the actual impact through the closures of countries and borders as a result of this COVID-19. It has meant that the world became quite fragmented again, with everyone confined to their own spaces. Whereas before that, aviation allowed the freedom for people to move around easily for different reasons that impact all of us in modern society today: to work, to trade, to do business, to learn, for medical aid, for medicines, to get across to remote areas, humanitarian efforts, etc. So it really is a critical aspect of life. And we are optimistic that we're going to see the aviation industry return post this crisis as soon as possible as well, because that is really essential to ensuring that the world is connected again.
Well, with these huge losses now, what can African countries do to boost the competitiveness of the region as an aviation market? I'm saying this because Africa is home to about 1.3 billion people, which is about 18% of the global population of 7.2 billion.
Yes, absolutely right. So you mentioned earlier on that, there are huge losses being recorded, and I already gave you some numbers about what some of those losses are for African airlines. But specifically, we're seeing some of these airlines start to get severely impacted. And in terms of competitiveness, African airlines were struggling anyway for many reasons. One, the policy underpinnings of African aviation, which doesn't see the continent as connected as it can be. So the single African air transport market, not yet coming into full implementation, created a challenge for competitiveness. Another issue is high taxes and charges that the industry has faced across different players. And it's easy, to put a tax on a ticket is relatively easy because you can collect those taxes easier than other modes of surcharging. And so aviation was always a bit of a target, particularly for African markets. But the news that I want to give for African aviation and for African people is that Africa is a huge continent. You can fit the USA, China, Mexico, Europe, and a few other countries into the landmass of Africa. And so Africa creates an opportunity for aviation to be a leapfrogging catalyst for its integration and its development. And so there are several areas where opportunities are for African governments at this moment in time to seize on the lull that we have seen from the pandemic to begin to redirect the aviation industry and to see how best we can make it work for us as African people.
With some of these challenges you have talked about now, putting that together with COVID-19, of course, the effects of COVID-19, do you think that more carriers will fold up and file for protection?
Yes, so let me just give you a few examples of those that have already done so. Air Mauritius filed for voluntary administration. South African Airways and South African Express are already in business rescue currently by the South African government. Air, which is another strong carrier in the South African economy, has also ceased trading. And a few other airlines across Africa are in severe financial crisis. So we expect, analysis shows that if before the end of June, the airlines don't get any direct support in terms of cash injections for liquidity purposes to support their working capital requirements, as well as to help pay off some debt obligations. Our analysis shows that 50% of airlines globally will go into insolvency. And if there's no relief by the end of July, analysis shows that it will be 90%. So this is really, really serious.
Yes, indeed. With your illustrations now, it's clear that African carriers, and especially in West Africa, are actually in the financial pits. But do you think that support from the World Bank, the IMF, and even the AFDB, for instance, can help restore some stability to the sector and the region?
Absolutely. So all kinds of support at this moment in time for the airline are necessary and are urgently needed. We wrote a joint letter, a joint relief appeal to international donor organizations, we being IATA, the United Nations World Tourism Organization, the World Travel and Tourism Council, the African Airlines Association, and the Association of Airlines for Southern Africa. We wrote a combined letter to these about 12 international donor institutions to engage with them, seeking for an aid of $10 billion to the travel and tourism industry. That is our estimate of what is needed in this period of time, at least to carry over the industry, not just the airlines, but all of the businesses that support aviation business and support economies to grow. So yes, definitely, we're any support that we can get from these organizations would be most useful. The only caveat there, though, is that there is such a thing as too much debt, and already the industry is starting to be strangled by the debt that's coming, particularly from relief. And we're already seeing that we have higher percentages of debt now compared to January of this year. And so only appeal here is that the debt should be given in a way that does not create an unbearable debt burden to the airlines and should be customized and targeted to each airline's specific circumstances.
As some economies begin their slow start to recovery now, passengers are reluctant to fly. Of course, that's because of fear, anxiety, and tight budgets, as well as the whole idea of being served by air stewards wearing masks and gloves being the new normal. But how do you think the airlines will respond to this situation?
So the airline industry is already being quite proactive on this point, understanding that continued closure of borders and as a result of that, continued grounding of the aviation industry negatively impacts economies because aviation contributes so much to the world's economies. We contribute 2.7 trillion to the global economy, and world trade by value is 35% carried by aviation. So we're quite critical to ensuring that economies continue to grow around. And so we've been quite proactive with trying to ensure that the industry can restart as safely and securely as possible until such a time as there is medication to either treat or cure the COVID-19 crisis. I think it goes without saying that we expect it to be with us for some time to come. But what we have done is looked at ways and measures in which we can ensure that as much as possible there is safety through the end-to-end passenger journey process. And we're working not just as IATA, but we're working with the international community, with the International Civil Aviation Organization, ICAO, with the World Health Organization, WHO, and with other players to ensure that we come up with a minimum set of guidelines that will support what we're calling these biosecurity measures. If you remember, under 9/11, there were several measures that were implemented after those attacks happened, and many of those we still see in place today. So what we're recommending is a set of measures, most of which will be temporary until once there is a cure and medication. And these measures are important to be able to give the government confidence to open again, as well as to give the passengers the confidence to fly again. And some of these measures, really look at that end-to-end journey. So we take into account what happens as soon as passengers come into the airport environment. So things like temperature screening, making sure that the staff are adequately trained, that the environment is duly sanitized and is kept in a sanitary condition throughout that process, ensuring social distancing at critical passenger touch points like check-in, security, boarding, ensuring that passengers wear masks as much as possible to limit the spread of the virus, and so on. So these are some of those measures which have been published and which were released by IATA on the 19th of May. We are also glad that the international collaborative effort that is ongoing will see a release of these global measures that I mentioned next Monday from the 1st of June. There will be something that passengers and all governments can rely on because it's been worked on in a coordinated, joined up manner.
Would like to thank you, Regional Head IATA for West Africa, Adefunke Adeyemi, for sharing your thoughts with us on the program.